Hey guys, thanks for joining me. I made sure to do some prep for this one for you. But if you wouldn't mind indulging me for just one quick moment for a couple apologies. One, the audio may not be quite as good as normal. My technical issues, won't get into it. I wanted to make sure I didn't want people with earphones to die. Also, I'm past the 20-hour mark of being awake, so I hope this is coherent. If not, pretend like it was, please. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing this up is I've heard that there's been a trend, I've even encountered it in some comments, of the HIIT people coming back around like they do every few years. For those that don't know what that is, HIIT in this context stands for high intensity training. How it goes about falls in a few various ways, but generally they push, just train really hard. You don't have to train very often. You barely have to train at all. You just go really, really hard, really hardcore, be really tough, and they try to make it sound really cool. Anyway, this is what I did all this for, to explain the different ways you can manipulate and try to actually work on your training to continue to make progress. There's these three main dials. I'll start with that. Frequency, volume, and intensity. Inside of these dials, there's smaller specific things you can manipulate and ways you can manipulate said dial. Such as with intensity, the load or the weight you're using, your proximity to failure, intensity techniques to go past failure, such as maybe a drop set or partner-assisted reps, and also supersets and giant sets, amongst others. These are just off the top of my head. For volume, that's just a few things like your total weekly sets, the amount of sets in a single session, and even the reps within a set. For instance, a set of 3 would be considered a low volume set, and a set of 20 would be considered a high one. And then frequency, whether it's the amount of sessions you do per week, you train twice a week, you train 6 days a week, and the amount of time you train a muscle per week. A bro split might have you train 6 days a week, but have you hit each muscle only once per week. Whereas you could do only 2 times a week training, but hit every muscle 2 times as well. That's what Alex Leonidas's Naturally Enhanced program did, which I ran and tried out, and so that's what I did. That's how those factors were manipulated. So for the people that bring up the whole high intensity kind of meme thing and push that, they're doing it off the example of an extreme minority, mind you, of people who put all their cards, all their money on this one dial and just crank that to max and break the dial and forget the others and put them down as low as possible. The 2 main names you will typically hear them reference are Dorian Yates and Mike Mentzer. If you're lucky, they might also mention Casey Viator, who is the main subject of the infamous Colorado experiment. If you want more info on that, Alexander Bromley fairly recently made a video that I think did a good job breaking it down for you. I'll link to that. And it's actually that experiment that kind of started off this whole high intensity camp, cult, meme, whatever you want to call it, that put all their cards here. What those advocates don't realize, that's at best 3 names they typically reference. I guess you will sometimes hear others as well, but they ignore all the other hundreds of professional bodybuilders, maybe thousands, depending on how many divisions and all this other stuff you're looking at, and all the tens of thousands of amateur regular bodybuilders, even me, just a regular dude that bodybuilds, and almost none of us who are past the intermediate stage, definitely past the novice stage, are using just intensity as the primary thing to push. Now, before I go on more about how valuable the other dials are to push and to use and ways to go on, I will want to talk a little bit about where just high intensity, low volume, and low frequency could potentially be useful by referencing the S-curves. Mathematically, not that I am an expert in mathematics by any means, I dropped my statistics class, but anyway, how an S-curve works is you start out low, there's an initial exponential increase, and then it eventually begins to taper off to where you start to get these increasingly small amounts of progress that never truly reach the ultimate potential of the S-curve, but start to and potentially slow down to a point to where it's imperceptibly different from. No, it reaches the point to where there's no longer perceivable progress in any meaningful way, even though you haven't reached the limit. Which is why also technically there isn't really a natty limit, but that's not the point of this video. So when you're here in the very initial beginner stages, you haven't trained. The only way you can go down is by being bedridden, and then you go further down. But otherwise, when you start training, you are right at this initial line where pushing any of these dials and actually beginning to train will make you begin to go up very quickly. But once you pass a certain point, you start to have to get more and more picky with the various factors you are manipulating to increase your training. So early on, there are probably a lot of beginners who can have success on a HIIT type program, a high intensity program with low volume and low frequency. But they will eventually hit a point where that is not enough, and you can only crank this so hard before you have to eventually do other things. So that's where I will give some credence. So if there are some people who want to come in and say, well, I started on a HIIT program and I've got great success. Well, as a beginner, I have no doubt that you might have. But show me all the advanced bodybuilders, natty or enhanced, who got to their advanced or elite levels just by cranking this lever. You'll only have those few examples that give their testimony that they did. Everybody else talks about using these other these other dials or levers or whatever, and other things you manipulate that aren't on that, such as outside gym factors, exercise selection, your technique, specificity, such as how a power lifter will bench differently than a bodybuilder because they are trying to get a performance goal for a powerlifting meet versus the bodybuilder just trying to get pectoral hypertrophy. The more advanced they get, the more they have to worry about all these other things. Intensity is only a single dial that they turn in order to keep pushing progress. A good example for someone that went heavy on the volume, and his era tended to do a lot of this. Arnold Schwarzenegger, in his book, I think it's called was it the Encyclopedia of a Bodybuilder? The first autobiography he did, assuming you completely trust his account, because he has an interesting relationship with the truth, as I'm told, is when he was in the Army, him being all big and muscle bound, is he was kind of used for recruitment. So his job basically in the Army was to have big muscles to make people want to join the Army. So he would get in trouble if he was ever caught not training, basically. So he had to develop a very, very high volume form of training so he could train for multiple hours every single day, so his sergeants and officers would constantly see him training. So he had to master pushing this one dial. But in order to maximally push this dial and get as much total volume as he could, he also had to push up this dial by training more days of the week so he could be seen training every day and for a long time every day. But in order to do that, he had to crank down this dial. So that's an example of someone who did basically the opposite of what the HIIT advocates do, where I believe it was like Mike Mentzer believed you should train like every 12 days or something like that. When there are other people who train 12 times a week by doing multiple two-a-days. So there's a lot of different ways that you're able to break this down and you have to manipulate things. This is, as I said, I hope this was coherent. There is not a one-way route to do this at all. For instance, how I'm doing it, I tend to favor the intensity a little bit more myself, primarily so I'm able to go less frequently and take less time. Because every set that you use to add volume is time. So more sets equals more times. More frequency equals yet another day you have to find a slot to go to the gym. So during my recent cut, I was training 3 days a week for a grand total of 4 hours of training every week. And I used lots of supersets and giant sets and some intensity techniques to allow me to get more out of my time and more out of my sets. Even now in a surplus, doing the little bit of like the slow bulk or the bulking with abs series I've talked about some. I've increased it to 4 days a week, so I've slightly increased the frequency, but I'm probably going to keep my trainer at only a grand total of 5 or 6 hours a week. So I'm still heavily relying on this dial to be as efficient with my time as possible, making the sessions very difficult. Supersets, giant sets, intensity techniques, depending on the movement I'm doing, heavier or lighter loads, as long as I can get close to failure, appropriately close to failure, depending on what's safe for the movement and such. But that is solely based on the fact that bodybuilding is not my number one priority. If it was, I would manipulate these dials in a completely different way for true optimal growth. But where I am in life, I cannot make bodybuilding the number one. It still needs to be high priority to make progress, but it's not the number one. So I'm gonna cut myself off there. I find myself having to cut myself off on these videos a lot because I can go on for a while if I let me. And if you let me, if I start noticing people watching the long videos a lot more, we could be in danger. So anyway, thanks for joining me here. If upon reflection I realize there's additional points that I'm able to dive in on and I find more use to revisit this topic, I'll make a second video. But for now, I want to respect your time. So thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.